The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued. Cassette 3, Side 1. As the Church ceased to be a set of devotees and became an institution governing millions of men, she tended to adopt a more lenient view of human frailty and to tolerate, sometimes to share, the pleasures of this world. A minority of Christians held such condescension to be treason to Christ. They resolved to gain heaven by poverty, chastity, and prayer, and retired completely from the world. Possibly Ashoka's missionaries, circa 250 B.C., had brought to the Near East the monastic forms as well as the theory and ethics of Buddhism. And pre-Christian anchorites like those of Serapis in Egypt, or the Essene communities in Judea, may have transmitted to Anthony and Pachomius the ideals and methods of the strictly religious life. Monasticism was for many souls a refuge from the chaos and war of the barbarian invasions. There were no taxes in the monastery or the desert cell, no military service, no marital strife, no weary toil. Ordination to the priesthood was not required of a monk, and after a few years of peace would come eternal bliss. Egypt, whose climate almost invited monasticism, teemed with anchoritic and cenobitic monks, following the solitary habits of Anthony or the community life that Pachomius had established at Theben. The Nile was banked with monasteries and convents, some containing as many as 3,000 monks and nuns. Of the anchorites, Anthony, circa 251 to 356, was by far the most renowned. After wandering from solitude to solitude, he fixed his cell on Mount Kozim, near the Red Sea. Admirers found him out, imitated his devotion, and built their cells as near to his as he would permit. Before he died, the desert was peopled with his spiritual progeny. He seldom washed and lived to the age of 105. He declined an invitation from Constantine, but at the age of 90 he journeyed to Alexandria to support Athanasius against the Arians. Only less famous was Pachomius, who, in 325, founded 9 monasteries and 1 nunnery. Sometimes 7,000 monks who followed his rule gathered to celebrate some holy day. These cenobites worked as well as prayed. Periodically they sailed down the Nile to Alexandria to sell their products, buy their necessities, and join in the ecclesiastical political fray. Among the anchorites a keen rivalry arose for the austerity championship. Macarius of Alexandria, says the Abbé Duchesne, could never hear of any feat of asceticism without at once trying to surpass it. If other monks ate no cooked food in Lent, Macarius ate none for 7 years. If some punished themselves with sleeplessness, Macarius could be seen frantically endeavoring for 20 consecutive nights to keep himself awake. Throughout one Lent he stood upright night and day and ate nothing except once a week a few cabbage leaves. And during this time he continued to work at his basket-weaving trade. For 6 months he slept in a marsh and exposed his naked body to poisonous flies. Some monks excelled in feats of solitude. So Serapion inhabited a cave at the bottom of an abyss into which few pilgrims had the hardihood to descend. When Jerome and Paula reached his lair, they found the man almost composed of bones, dressed only in a loincloth, face and shoulders covered by uncut hair. His cell was barely large enough for a bed of leaves and a plank. Yet this man had lived among the aristocracy of Rome. Some, like Bessarion, for 40, Pachomius for 50 years, never lay down while they slept. Some specialized in silence, and went many years without uttering a word. Others carried heavy weights wherever they went, or bound their limbs with iron bracelets, greaves, or chains. Many proudly recorded the number of years since they had looked upon a woman's face. Nearly all anchorites lived, some to a great age, on a narrow range of food. Jerome tells of monks who subsisted exclusively on figs or on barley bread. When Macarius was ill, someone brought him grapes. Unwilling so to indulge himself, he sent them to another hermit, who sent them to another, and so they made the rounds of the desert, Rufinus assures us, until they came back intact to Macarius. The pilgrims who flocked from all quarters of the Christian world to see the monks of the East credited them with miracles as remarkable as those of Christ. They could cure diseases or repel demons by a touch or a word, tame serpents or lions with a look or a prayer, and cross the Nile on the back of a crocodile. The relics of the anchorites became the most precious possession of Christian churches and are treasured in them to this day. In the monasteries, the abbot required absolute obedience and tested novices with impossible commands. One abbot, Story says, offered a novice to leap into a raging furnace. The novice obeyed. The flame, we are informed, parted to let him pass. Another monk was told to plant the abbot's walking stick in the earth and water it till it flowered. For years he walked daily to the Nile, 2 miles away, to draw water to pour upon the stick. In the 3rd year, God took pity on him, and the stick bloomed. Work was prescribed for the monks, says Jerome, lest they be led astray by dangerous imaginings. Some tilled fields, some tended gardens, wove mats or baskets, carved wooden shoes, or copied manuscripts. Many ancient classics were preserved by their pens. Most Egyptian monks, however, were innocent of letters and scorned secular knowledge as a futile conceit. Many of them considered cleanliness hostile to godliness. The Virgin Sylvia refused to wash any part of her body except her fingers. In a convent of 130 nuns, none ever bathed or washed the feet. Towards the end of the 4th century, however, the monks became resigned to water, and the abbot Alexander, scorning this decadence, looked back longingly to the time when monks never washed the face. The Near East rivaled Egypt in the number and marvels of its monks and nuns. Jerusalem and Antioch were meshed with monastic communities or cells. The Syrian desert was peopled with anchorites. Some of them, like Hindu fakirs, bound themselves with chains to immovable rocks. Others disdained so settled a habitation and roamed over the mountains eating grass. Simeon Stylites, possibly from 390 to 459, we are told, used to go without food through the 40 days of Lent. During one Lent he was, at his own insistence, walled up in an enclosure with a little bread and water. On Easter he was unwalled, and the bread and the water were found untouched. At Kalat Zaman, in northern Syria, about 422, Simeon built himself a column 6 feet high and lived on it. Ashamed of his moderation, he built and lived on ever taller columns until he made his permanent abode on a pillar 60 feet high. Its circumference at the top was little more than 3 feet. A railing kept the saint from falling to the ground in his sleep. On this perch Simeon lived uninterruptedly for 30 years, exposed to rain and sun and cold. A ladder enabled disciples to take him food and remove his waste. He bound himself to the pillar by a rope. The rope became embedded in his flesh, which putrefied around it, stank, and teemed with worms. Simeon picked up the worms that fell from his sores and replaced them there, saying to them, "Eat what God has given you." From his high pulpit he preached sermons to the crowds that came to see him, converted barbarians, performed marvelous cures, played ecclesiastical politics, and shamed the moneylenders into reducing their interest charges from 12 to 6%. His exalted piety created a fashion of pillar hermits, which lasted for 12 centuries, and, in a thoroughly secularized form, persists today. The Church did not approve of such excesses. Perhaps she sensed a fierce pride in these humiliations, a spiritual greed in this self-denial, a secret sensualism in this flight from woman and the world. The records of these ascetics abound in sexual visions and dreams. Their cells resounded with their moans as they struggled with imaginary temptations and erotic thoughts. They believed that the air about them was full of demons assailing them. The monks seemed to have found it harder to be virtuous in solitude than if they had lived among all the opportunities of the town. It was not unusual for anchorites to go mad. Rufinus tells of a young monk whose cell was entered by a beautiful woman. He succumbed to her charms, after which she disappeared, he thought, into the air. The monk ran out wildly to the nearest village and leaped into the furnace of a public bath to cool his fire. In another case, a young woman begged admission to a monk's cell on the plea that wild beasts were pursuing her. He consented to take her in briefly, but in that hour she happened to touch him, and the flame of desire sprang up in him as if all his years of austerity had left it undimmed. He tried to grasp her, but she vanished from his arms and his sight, and a chorus of demons, we are told, exulted with loud laughter over his fall. This monk, says Rufinus, could no longer bear the monastic life. Like Paphnus in Anatole France's Thais, he could not exorcise the vision of beauty that he had imagined or seen. He left his cell, plunged into the life of the city, and followed that vision at last into hell. The organized church had at first no control over the monks, who rarely took any degree of holy orders. Yet she felt responsibility for their excesses, since she shared in the glory of their deeds. She could not afford to agree completely with monastic ideals. She praised celibacy, virginity, and poverty, but could not condemn marriage or parentage or property as sins. She had now a stake in the continuance of the race. Some monks left their cells or monasteries at will and troubled the populace with their begging. Some went from town to town preaching asceticism, selling real or bogus relics, terrorizing synods and exciting impressionable people to destroy pagan temples or statuary, or now and then to kill in Hypatia. The Church could not tolerate these independent actions. The Council of Chalcedon, in 451, ordained that greater circumspection should be used in admitting persons to monastic vows, that such vows should be irrevocable, and that no one should organize a monastery or leave it without permission from the bishop of the diocese. 2. The Eastern Bishops. Christianity was now, in 400, almost completely triumphant in the East. In Egypt, the native Christians, or Copts, were already a majority of the population, supporting hundreds of churches and monasteries. 90 Egyptian bishops acknowledged the authority of the Patriarch in Alexandria, who almost rivaled the power of the Pharaohs and the Ptolemies. Some of these patriarchs were ecclesiastical politicians of no lovable type, like the Theophilus, who burned to the ground the pagan temple and library of Serapis in 389. More pleasing is the modest bishop of Ptolemais, Synesius. Born in Cyrene, circa 365, he studied mathematics and philosophy at Alexandria under Hypatia. To the end of his life he remained her devoted friend, calling her the true exponent of the true philosophy. He visited Athens and was there confirmed in his paganism, but in 403 he married a Christian lady and gallantly accepted Christianity. He found it a simple courtesy to transform his Neoplatonic trinity of the One, the Nous, and the Soul into the Father, Spirit, and the Son. He wrote many delightful letters and some minor philosophical works, of which none is of value to anyone today except his essay In Praise of Baldness. In 410, Theophilus offered him the bishopric of Ptolemais. He was now a country gentleman with more money than ambition. He protested that he was unfit, that he did not, as the Nicene Creed required, believe in the resurrection of the body, that he was married, and had no intention of abandoning his wife. Theophilus, to whom dogmas were instruments, winked at these errors and transformed Synesius into a bishop before the philosopher could make up his mind. It was typical of him that his last letter was to Hypatia and his last prayer to Christ. In Syria, the pagan temples were disposed of in the manner of Theophilus. Imperial edicts ordered them closed. The surviving pagans resisted the order but resigned themselves to defeat on noting the indifference with which their gods accepted destruction. Asiatic Christianity had saner leaders than those of Egypt. In a short life of 50 years, possibly from 329 to 379, the great Basil learned rhetoric under Libanius in Constantinople, studied philosophy in Athens, visited the anchorites of Egypt and Syria, and rejected their introverted asceticism, became bishop of Caesarea in Cappadocia, organized Christianity in his country, revised its ritual, introduced self-supporting Cenobitic monasticism, and drew up a monastic rule that still governs the monasteries of the Greco-Slavonic world. He advised his followers to avoid the theatrical severities of the Egyptian anchorites, but rather to serve God, health, and sanity by useful work. Tilling the fields, he thought, was an excellent prayer. To this day, the Christian East acknowledges his preeminent influence. In Constantinople, hardly a sign of pagan worship remained. Christianity itself, however, was torn with conflict. Arianism was still powerful, new heresies were always rising, and every man had his own theology. This city, wrote Basil's brother Gregory of Nyassa about 380, is full of mechanics and slaves who are all of them profound theologians and preach in the shops and the streets. If you desire a man to change a piece of silver, he informs you wherein the Son differs from the Father. If you ask the price of a loaf, you are told that the Son is inferior to the Father. And if you inquire whether the bath is ready, the answer is, the Son was made out of nothing. In the reign of Theodosius I, the Syrian Isaac founded the first monastery in the new capital. Similar institutions rapidly multiplied, and by 400 the monks were a power and a terror in the city, playing a noisy role in the conflicts of patriarch with patriarch and of patriarch with emperor. Gregory Nazianzen learned the bitterness of sectarian hatred when he accepted a call from the Orthodox Christians of Constantinople to be their bishop in 379. Valens had just died, but the Arians whom that emperor had set up were still in ecclesiastical control and held their services in St. Sophia. Gregory had to house his altar and his congregation in the home of a friend, but he called his modest church by a hopeful name, Anastasia, or Resurrection. He was a man of equal piety and learning. He had studied in Athens along with his countryman Basil, and only his second successor would rival his eloquence. His congregation grew and grew till it was larger than those of the official basilicas. On the eve of Easter, 379, a crowd of Arians attacked the Anastasia Chapel with a volley of stones. 18 months later, the Orthodox Emperor Theodosius led Gregory in pomp and triumph to his proper throne in St. Sophia. But ecclesiastical politics soon ended his tranquility. Jealous bishops proclaimed his appointment invalid and ordered him to defend himself before a council. Too proud to fight for his see, Gregory resigned in 381 and returned to Cappadocian Nazianzus to spend the remaining 8 years of his life in obscurity and peace. When his indifferent successor died, the imperial court invited to St. Sophia a priest of Antioch known to history as St. John Chrysostom of the Golden Mouth. Born, possibly in 345, of a noble family, he had imbibed rhetoric from Libanius, had familiarized himself with pagan literature and philosophy. In general, the Eastern prelates were more learned and disputatious than those of the West. John was a man of keen intellect and sharper temper. He disturbed his new congregation by taking Christianity seriously, condemning in plain terms the injustices and immoralities of the age. He denounced the theater as an exhibition of lewd women and as a school of profanity, seduction, and intrigue. He asked the opulent Christians of the capital why they spent so much of their wealth in loose living instead of giving most of it to the poor as Christ had commanded. He wondered why some men had 20 mansions, 20 baths, 1,000 slaves, doors of ivory, floors of mosaic, walls of marble, ceilings of gold, and threatened the rich with hell for entertaining their guests with oriental dancing girls. He scolded his clergy for their lazy and luxurious lives and their suspicious use of women to minister to them in their rectories. He deposed 13 of the bishops under his jurisdiction for licentiousness or simony, and he reproved the monks of Constantinople for being more frequently in the streets than in their cells. He practiced what he preached. The revenues of his see were spent not in the display that usually marked the Eastern bishoprics, but in the establishment of hospitals and in assistance to the poor. Never had Constantinople heard sermons so powerful, brilliant, and frank. Here were no pious abstractions, but Christian precepts applied so specifically that they hurt. Who could be more oppressive than the landlords? If you look at the way in which they treat their miserable tenants, you will find them more savage than barbarians. They lay intolerable and continual imposts upon men who are weakened with hunger and toil throughout their lives, and they put upon them the burden of oppressive services. They make them work all through the winter in cold and rain, they deprive them of sleep, and send them home with empty hands. The tortures and beatings, the exactions and ruthless demands for services which such men suffer from agents are worse than hunger. Who could recount the ways in which these agents use them for profit and then cheat them? Their labor turns the agent's olive press, but they receive not a scrap of the produce which they are compelled illegally to bottle for the agents, and they get only a tiny sum for their work. Congregations like to be scolded, but not to be reformed. The women persisted in their perfumes, the wealthy in their banquets, the clergy in their female domestics, the theaters in their revelations, and soon every group in the city except the powerless poor was against the man with the golden mouth. The Empress Eudoxia, wife of Arcadius, was leading the gay set of the capital in luxurious living. She interpreted one of John's sermons as alluding to her, and she demanded of her weakling husband that he call a synod to try the patriarch. In 403, a council of Eastern bishops met at Chalcedon. John refused to appear on the ground that he should not be tried by his enemies. The council deposed him, and he went quietly into exile. But so great a clamor of protest arose from the people that the frightened emperor recalled him to his see. A few months later, he was again denouncing the upper classes and made some critical comments on a statue of the empress. Eudoxia once more demanded his expulsion, and Theophilus of Alexandria, always ready to weaken a rival see, reminded Arcadius that the Chalcedon decree of deposition still stood and could be enforced. Soldiers were sent to seize Chrysostom. He was conveyed across the Bosporus and banished to a village in Armenia in 404. When his faithful followers heard the news, they broke out in wild insurrection, and in the tumult St. Sophia and the nearby Senate House were set on fire. From his exile, Chrysostom sent letters of appeal to Honorius and the Bishop of Rome. Arcadius ordered him removed to the remote desert of Pitius in Pontus. On the way, the exhausted prelate died at Comena in the 62nd year of his age, in 407. From that time to this, with brief intermissions, the Eastern Church has remained the servant of the state. 5. St. Augustine, 354 to 430. 1. The Sinner. The North Africa in which Augustine was born was a miscellany of breeds and creeds. Punic and Numidian blood mingled with Roman in the population, perhaps in Augustan. So many of the people spoke Punic, the old Phoenician language of Carthage, that Augustan as bishop appointed only priests who could speak it. Donatism challenged orthodoxy, Manichaeism challenged both, and apparently the majority of the people were still pagan. Augustine's birthplace was Tagaste in Numidia. His mother, St. Monica, was a devoted Christian whose life was almost consumed in caring and praying for her wayward son. His father was a man of narrow means and broad principles, whose infidelities were patiently accepted by Monica in the firm belief that they could not last forever. At 12, the boy was sent to school at Madara, and at 17 to higher studies at Carthage. Salvian would soon describe Africa as the cesspool of the world, and Carthage as the cesspool of Africa, hence Monica's parting advice to her son. She commanded me, and with much earnestness forewarned me, that I should not commit fornication, and especially that I should never defile any man's wife. These seemed to me no better than women's counsels, which it would be a shame for me to follow. I ran headlong with such blindness that I was ashamed among my equals to be guilty of less impudency than they were, whom I heard brag mightily of their naughtiness, yea, and so much the more boasting by how much more they had been beastly. And I took pleasure to do it, not for the pleasure of the act only, but for the praise of it also. And when I lacked opportunity to commit a wickedness that should make me as bad as the lost, I would feign myself to have done what I never did. He proved an apt pupil in Latin also, and in rhetoric, mathematics, music, and philosophy. My unquiet mind was altogether intent to seek for learning. He disliked Greek, and never mastered it or learned its literature, but he was so fascinated by Plato that he called him a demigod, and did not cease to be a Platonist when he became a Christian. His pagan training in logic and philosophy prepared him to be the most subtle theologian of the Church. Having graduated, he taught grammar at Tagaste, and then rhetoric at Carthage. Since he was now 16, there was much ado to get me a wife. However, he preferred a concubine, a convenience sanctioned by pagan morals and Roman law. Still unbaptized, Augustine could take his morals where he pleased. Concubinage was for him a moral advance. He abandoned promiscuity and seems to have been faithful to his concubine until their parting in 385. In 382, still a lad of 18, he found himself unwillingly the father of a son, whom he called at one time son of my sin, but more usually Adiodatus, gift of God. He came to love the boy tenderly and never let him go far from his side. At 29, he left Carthage for the larger world of Rome. His mother, fearing that he would die unbaptized, begged him not to go, and when he persisted, besought him to take her with him. He pretended to consent, but at the dock he left her at prayer in a chapel and sailed without her. At Rome he taught rhetoric for a year, but the students cheated him of his fees, and he applied for a professorship at Milan. Symmachus examined him, approved, and sent him to Milan by state post. There his brave mother overtook him and persuaded him to listen with her to the sermons of Ambrose. He was moved by them, but even more by the hymns the congregation sang. At the same time, Monica won him over to the idea of marriage, and in effect betrothed him, now 32, to a girl with more money than years. Augustine agreed to wait 2 years till she should be 12. As a preliminary, he sent his mistress back to Africa, where she buried her grief in a nunnery. A few weeks of continence unnerved him, and instead of marrying, he took another concubine. "Give me chastity," he prayed, "but not yet." Amid these diversions, he found time for theology. He had begun with his mother's simple faith, but had cast it off proudly at school. For 9 years, from 374 to 383, he accepted Manichaean dualism as the most satisfactory explanation of a world so indifferently compounded of evil and good. For a time he flirted with the skepticism of the later academy, but he was too emotional to remain long in suspended judgment. At Rome and Milan he studied Plato and Plotinus. Neoplatonism entered deeply into his philosophy, and through him dominated Christian theology till Abélard. It became for Augustine the vestibule to Christianity. Ambrose had recommended him to read the Bible in the light of Paul's statement that the letter killeth, but the Spirit maketh to live. Augustine found that a symbolic interpretation removed what had seemed to him the puerilities of Genesis. He read Paul's epistles and felt that here was a man who, like himself, had passed through 1,000 doubts. In Paul's final faith there had been no mere abstract Platonic logos, but a divine word that had become man. One day, as Augustine sat in a Milan garden with his friend Alypius, a voice seemed to keep ringing in his ears, "Take up and read, take up and read." He opened Paul again and read, Not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envying, but put ye on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make not provision for the flesh to fulfill the lusts thereof. The passage completed for Augustine a long evolution of feeling and thought. There was something infinitely warmer and deeper in this strange faith than in all the logic of philosophy. Christianity came to him as a profound emotional satisfaction. Surrendering the skepticism of the intellect, he found for the first time in his life moral stimulus and mental peace. His friend Alypius confessed himself ready for a like submission. Monica, receiving their capitulation, melted her heart out in grateful prayer. On Easter Sunday of 387, Augustine, Alypius, and Adeodatus were baptized by Ambrose, with Monica standing happily by. All four resolved to go to Africa and live a monastic life. At Ostia, Monica died, confident of reunion in paradise. Arrived in Africa, Augustine sold his modest patrimony and gave the proceeds to the poor. Then he and Alypius and some friends formed a religious community and lived at Tagaste in poverty, celibacy, study, and prayer. So was founded, in 388, the Augustinian Order, the oldest monastic fraternity in the West. 2. The Theologian. In 389, Adeodatus passed away, and Augustine mourned him as bitterly as if still uncertain of the eternal bliss awaiting those who died in Christ. Work and writing were his only consolations. In 391, Valerius, bishop of nearby Hippo, now Beaune, asked his aid in administering the diocese, and for this purpose ordained him a priest. Valerius often yielded the pulpit to him, and Augustine's eloquence impressed the congregation even when they could not understand him. Hippo was a seaport of some 40,000 population. The Catholics had one church there, the Donatists another. The remainder of the people were Manichaeans or pagans. The Manichaean bishop, Fortunatus, had hitherto dominated the theological scene. Donatists joined Catholics in urging Augustine to meet him in debate. He consented, and for 2 days these novel gladiators crossed words before a crowd that filled the baths of Socius. Augustine won. Fortunatus left Hippo and never returned, this in 392. 4 years later, Valerius, alleging his age, asked the congregation to choose his successor. Augustine was unanimously elected, and though he protested and wept and begged the privilege of returning to his monastery, he was prevailed upon, and for the remaining 34 years of his life he was Bishop of Hippo. From this foot of earth he moved the world. He chose 1 or 2 deacons and brought 2 monks from his monastery to help him. They lived monastically and communistically in the episcopal rectory. Augustine was a bit puzzled to understand how one of his aides at death could leave a tidy legacy. All subsisted on a vegetarian diet, reserving meat for guests and the sick. Augustine himself is described as short and thin, and never strong. He complained of a lung disorder and suffered unduly from the cold. He was a man of sensitive nerves, easily excited, of keen and somewhat morbid imagination, of subtle and flexible intellect. Despite a tenacious dogmatism and some occasional intolerance, he must have had many lovable qualities. Several men who came to learn rhetoric from him accepted his lead into Christianity, and Alypius followed him to the end. He had hardly taken his seat as bishop when he began a lifelong war against the Donatists. He challenged their leaders to public debate, but few cared to accept. He invited them to friendly conferences, but was met first with silence, then with insult, then with violence. Several Catholic bishops in North Africa were assaulted, and some attempts seem to have been made upon the life of Augustine himself. However, we do not have the Donatist side of this story. In 411, a council called by the Emperor Honorius met at Carthage to quiet the Donatist dispute. The Donatists sent 279 bishops, the Catholics 286. But bishop in Africa meant little more than parish priest. The emperor's legate, Marcellinus, after hearing both sides, decreed that the Donatists must hold no further meetings and must hand over all their churches to the Catholics. The Donatists replied with acts of desperate violence, including, we are told, the murder of Restitutus, a priest of Hippo, and the mutilation of another member of Augustine's staff. Augustine urged the government to enforce its decree vigorously. He retracted his earlier view that no one should be coerced into the unity of Christ, that we must fight only by arguments and prevail only by force of reason. He concluded that the Church, being the spiritual father of all, should have a parent's right to chastise an unruly son for his own good. It seemed to him better that a few Donatists should suffer than that all should be damned for want of coercion. At the same time, he pled repeatedly with the state officials not to enforce the death penalty against the heretics. Aside from this bitter contest and the cares of his see, Augustine lived in the country of the mind and labored chiefly with his pen. Almost every day he wrote a letter whose influence is still active in Catholic theology. His sermons alone fill volumes, and though some are spoiled by an artificial rhetoric of opposed and balanced clauses, and many deal with local and transient topics in a simple style adapted to his unlettered congregation, many of them rise to a noble eloquence born of mystic passion and profound belief. His busy mind, trained in the logic of the schools, could not be confined within the issues of his parish. In treatise after treatise he labored to reconcile with reason the doctrines of the Church that he had come to revere as the one pillar of order and decency in a ruined and riotous world. He knew that the Trinity was a stumbling block to the intellect. For 15 years he worked on his most systematic production, De Trinitate, struggling to find analogies in human experience for three persons in one God. More puzzling still, filling all Augustine's life with wonder and debate, was the problem of harmonizing the free will of man with the foreknowledge of God. If God is omniscient, he sees the future in all details. Since God is immutable, this picture that he has of all coming events lays upon them the necessity of occurring as he has foreseen them. They are irrevocably predestined. Then how can man be free? Must he not do what God has foreseen? And if God has foreseen all things, he has known from all eternity the final fate of every soul that he creates. Why, then, should he create those that are predestined to be damned? In his first years as a Christian, Augustine had written a treatise, De Libero Arbitrio, on free will. He had sought then to square the existence of evil with the benevolence of an omnipotent God, and his answer was that evil is the result of free will. God could not leave man free without giving him the possibility of doing wrong as well as right. Later, under the influence of Paul's epistles, he argued that Adam's sin had left upon the human race a stain of evil inclination, that no amount of good works, but only the freely given grace of God, could enable the soul to overcome this inclination, erase this stain, and achieve salvation. God offered this grace to all, but many refused it. God knew that they would refuse it, but this possibility of damnation was the price of that moral freedom without which man would not be man. The divine foreknowledge does not destroy this freedom. God merely foresees the choices that men will freely make. Augustine did not invent the doctrine of original sin. Paul, Tertullian, Cyprian, Ambrose had taught it, but his own experience of sin and of the voice that had converted him had left in him a somber conviction that the human will is from birth inclined to evil and can be turned to good only by the gratuitous act of God. He could not explain the evil inclination of the will except as an effect of Eve's sin and Adam's love. Since we are all children of Adam, Augustine argued, we share his guilt, are indeed the offspring of his guilt. The original sin was concupiscence. And concupiscence still befouls every act of generation. By the very connection of sex with parentage, mankind is a mass of perdition, and most of us will be damned. Some of us will be saved, but only through the grace of the suffering Son of God, and through the intercession of the mother who conceived him sinlessly. Through a woman we were sent to destruction. Through a woman salvation was restored to us. Writing so much and so hurriedly, often it appears by dictation to amanuenses, Augustine fell more than once into exaggerations which later he strove to modify. At times he propounded the Calvinistic doctrine that God arbitrarily chose from all eternity the elect to whom he would give his saving grace. A crowd of critics rose to plague him for such theories. He conceded nothing, but fought every point to the end. From England came his ablest opponent, the footloose monk Pelagius, with a strong defense of man's freedom and of the saving power of good works. God indeed helps us, said Pelagius, by giving us his law and commandments, by the example and precepts of his saints, by cleansing waters of baptism and the redeeming blood of Christ. But God does not tip the scales against our salvation by making human nature inherently evil. There was no original sin, no fall of man. Only he who commits a sin is punished for it. It transmits no guilt to his progeny. God does not predestine man to heaven or hell, does not choose arbitrarily whom he will damn or save. He leaves the choice of our fate to ourselves. The theory of innate human depravity, said Pelagius, was a cowardly shifting to God of the blame for man's sins. Man feels and therefore is responsible. If I ought, I can. Pelagius came to Rome about 400, lived with pious families, and earned a reputation for virtue. In 409 he fled from Alaric, first to Carthage, then to Palestine. There he dwelt in peace till the Spanish priest Orosius came from Augustine to warn Jerome against him, this in 415. An Eastern synod tried the monk and declared him orthodox. An African synod, prodded by Augustine, repudiated this finding and appealed to Pope Innocent I, who declared Pelagius a heretic, whereupon Augustine hopefully announced, "Causa finita est," the case is finished. But Innocent, dying, was succeeded by Zosimus, who pronounced Pelagius guiltless. The African bishops appealed to Honorius. The emperor was pleased to correct the pope. Zosimus yielded in 418, and the Council of Ephesus in 431 condemned as a heresy the Pelagian view that man can be good without the helping grace of God. Augustine could be caught in contradictions and absurdities, even in morbid cruelties of thought, but he could not be overcome, because in the end his own soul's adventures and the passion of his nature, not any chain of reasoning, molded his theology. He knew the weakness of the intellect. It was the individual's brief experience sitting in reckless judgment upon the experience of the race. And how could 40 years understand 40 centuries? "Dispute not by excited argument," he wrote to a friend, "those things which you do not yet comprehend, or those which in the Scriptures appear to be incongruous and contradictory. Meekly defer the day of your understanding." Faith must precede understanding. Seek not to understand that you may believe, but believe that you may understand. Crede ut intelligas. The authority of the Scriptures is higher than all the efforts of the human intelligence. The Bible, however, need not always be taken literally. It was written to be intelligible to simple minds, and had to use corporeal terms for spiritual realities. When interpretations differ, we must rest in the decision of the church councils, in the collective wisdom of her wisest men. But even faith is not enough for understanding. There must be a clean heart to let in the rays of the divinity that surrounds us. So, humbled and cleansed, one may, after many years, rise to the real end and essence of religion, which is the possession of the living God. I desire to know God and the soul. Nothing more, nothing whatever. Oriental Christianity spoke mostly of Christ. Augustine's theology is of the first person. It is of and to God the Father that he speaks and writes. He gives no description of God, for only God can know God fully. Probably the true God has neither sex, age, nor body. But we can know God, in a sense, intimately through creation. Everything in the world is an infinite marvel in its organization and functioning, and would be impossible without a creative intelligence. The order, symmetry, and rhythm of living things proclaims a kind of Platonic deity, in whom beauty and wisdom are one. We need not believe, says Augustine, that the world was created in 6 days. Probably God in the beginning created only a nebulous mass, nebulosa species, but in this mass lay the seminal order, or productive capacities, rationes seminales, from which all things would develop by natural causes. For Augustine, as for Plato, the actual objects and events of this world pre-existed in the mind of God as the plan of a building is conceived by the architect before it is built, and creation proceeds in time according to these eternal exemplars in the divine mind. 3. The Philosopher. How shall we do justice, so briefly, to so powerful a personality and so fertile a pen? Through 230 treatises he spoke his mind on almost every problem of theology and philosophy, and usually in a style warm with feeling and bright with new-coined phrases from his copious mint. He discussed with diffidence and subtlety the nature of time. He anticipated Descartes' cogito ergo sum. To refute the academics who denied that man can be certain of anything, he argued, who doubts that he lives and thinks? For if he doubts, he lives. He presaged Bergson's complaint that the intellect, through long dealing with corporeal things, is a constitutional materialist. He proclaimed, like Kant, that the soul is the most directly known of all realities, and clearly stated the idealistic position, that since matter is known only through mind, we cannot logically reduce mind to matter. He suggested the Schopenhauerian thesis that will, not intellect, is fundamental in man. And he agreed with Schopenhauer that the world would be improved if all reproduction should cease. 2 of his works belong to the classics of the world's literature. The Confessions, circa 400, is the first and most famous of all autobiographies. It is addressed directly to God, as a 100,000-word act of contrition. It begins with the sins of his youth, tells vividly the story of his conversion, and occasionally bursts into a rhapsody of prayer. All confessions are camouflage, but there was in this one a sincerity that shocked the world. Even as Augustine wrote it, 46 and a bishop, the old carnal ideas still live in my memory and rush into my thoughts. In sleep they come upon me not to delight only, but even so far as consent, and most like to the deed. Bishops are not always so psychoanalytically frank. His masterpiece is the moving story of how one soul came to faith and peace, and its first lines are its summary. Thou hast created us for thyself, and our hearts know no rest until they repose in thee. His faith is now unquestioning, and rises to a moving theodicy. Too late I came to love thee, O thou beauty, both so ancient and so fresh. Yea, also the heaven and the earth, and all that is in them, bid me on every side that I should love thee. What now do I love when I love thee? I asked the earth, and it answered, I am not it. I asked the sea, and the deeps and the creeping things, and they answered, We are not thy God, seek above us. I asked the fleeting winds, and the whole air with its inhabitants answered me, Anaximenes was deceived, I am not God. I asked the heavens, the sun and moon and stars, nor said they, Are we the God whom thou seekest? And I replied unto all these, Answer me concerning God. Since that you are not he, answer me concerning him. And they cried out with a loud voice, He made us. They are not well in their wits, to whom anything which thou hast created is displeasing. In thy gift we rest, and in thy good pleasure lies our peace. The Confessions is poetry and prose. The City of God, 413 to 426, is philosophy and history. When the news of Alaric's sack of Rome reached Africa, followed by thousands of desolate refugees, Augustine was stirred, like Jerome and others, by what seemed an irrational and satanic calamity. Why should the city whose beauty and power men had built and reverenced through centuries, and now the citadel of Christendom, be surrendered by a benevolent deity to the ravages of barbarians? Pagans everywhere attributed the disaster to Christianity. The ancient gods, plundered, dethroned, and proscribed, had withdrawn their protection from the Rome that under their guidance had grown and prospered for 1,000 years. Many Christians were shaken in their faith. Augustine felt the challenge deeply. All his vast temple of theology threatened to collapse if this panic of fear were not allayed. He resolved to devote all the powers of his genius to convincing the Roman world that such catastrophes did not for a moment impugn Christianity. For 13 years he labored on his book amid oppressive obligations and distractions. He published it in piecemeal installments. The middle of it forgot the beginning and did not foresee the end. Inevitably, its 1,200 pages become a confused concatenation of essays on everything from the first sin to the last judgment, and only the depth of its thought and the splendor of its style lifted it out of its chaos to the highest rank in the literature of Christian philosophy. Augustine's initial answer was that Rome had been punished not for her new religion, but for her continued sins. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.